Good afternoon. My name is Donna Satterthwaite. I am Assistant Deputy Director or Interim Deputy Director, Acting Deputy Director right now, and Workforce Development Director for Senior Service America. And I appreciate all this buzzing that's going around because that means people are meeting new friends, sharing ideas, sharing thoughts, thinking about things they're going to do when they go back home. So I really do appreciate that. It has been, I hope for you, a great day thus far. Great. And you know what? That continues with this last presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce John Colbert today. John is co-founder of CHP Consulting, a consulting firm dedicated to assisting nonprofit and workforce-related programs, including being a partner of our company, Senior Service America. John has a wealth of experience in workforce and social services programming, having served in the Clinton administration as Chief of Staff of the Department of Labor's Employment and Training Administration. He was also a point person for the department on the reauthorization and implementation of the Older Americans Act, the Workforce Investment Act, the Welfare to Work Act, as well as being a liaison to the Appropriations Committee. Now, in his work at CHP Consulting, John has provided a broad spectrum of legal, regulatory, and programmatic guidance to nonprofit organizations, including multiple reauthorizations of SCSEP, as well as the enactment of WIOA. An attorney in private practice before entering government, he's also served as senior counsel to both the National Center on Education and the Economy, as well as Jobs for the Future. And as well, he's been an advisor to the former Deputy Prime Minister of Ireland, focusing on fostering the Irish peace process. So John today will provide us with the current state of play in Washington, D.C., and what it all means to each of us in this room. But I'm going off script for a minute. How many have watched a Capitol 4th concert or Memorial Day concert on PBS? Can you raise your hands? Great. Let me tell you some good information about John Colbert. John's late father, Jerry Colbert, and his brother, Michael Colbert, have been the executive producers pretty much since the inception or start of the Capitol 4th concert and Memorial Day concert that takes place on the Capitol grounds. So, John, just about, I don't know if you can see us, but just about everybody raised their hands. And we are appreciative of what your father has done over the years and what your brother continues to do. And so with that, please welcome John Colbert.
Well, thank you so much, Donna. And hello to everyone at Force for the Future. I hope you're enjoying your time in Dallas and, as Donna said, making new friends and new colleagues. I understand that I'm the only thing keeping you from going out and trick-or-treating tonight as the last presenter at the conference. So why don't we get started and we'll talk about a little bit about what's happening in Washington and how it impacts us. It's a fascinating moment in time. 1 week, less than 1 week before the midterm elections. And certainly there's a lot of uncertainty in both parties as to what's happening right at this moment. But I really want to take a look at it from our particular vantage point and the impact on older workers, social service programming, and workforce programming in particular, to be able to distill what to anticipate with these elections, what policy changes might occur as a result, and be able to think through what the next steps are for us. So we'll dive right in because we need to understand, first of all, what's happened the past 2 years when it comes to federal funding, and be able to look ahead and figure out exactly what's happening as far as the administration's priorities, as well as Congress's priorities, and how a Democratic majority in the House, if that occurs, what changes might happen. Finally, we'll take a look at what's happening in the elections in the House, Senate, and how the president has historically played a major role in the midterm elections, as well as a brief look at the gubernatorial elections. And we'll follow up that with Q&A. So let's get rolling. 2018 funding, what did we learn? Well, we were really concerned with the Trump administration's first budget because it had nearly a 10% cut overall to domestic programs. Bigger cuts to some than others. And when it came to where some of the largest cuts were, it was the Department of Labor, over a 20% cut overall. And as you can see the chart there, the elimination of SCSEP was front and center. And we really had to wonder about what was going to happen to us as a result of that. And the good news is that the president's budget was summarily dismissed by Congress, which was a bit of a surprise in an all-Republican environment. Usually the party and the administration works well if it's the same party in Congress. But in this case, the Congress said, thanks very much, Mr. President, but we're going to craft our own proposal, and we want to, where we can, work in a bipartisan manner when it comes to overall funding. So in 2018, FY 2018, which we're now operating under as SCSEP, the funding for our program was restored. We were back at the $400 million level instead of being eliminated. And WIOA and apprenticeship programs in the workforce space also did quite well in this environment. So the question became, how did we not get cut? There were significant cuts being proposed by the administration. We ended up level funded or a little better in some cases. Well, the major reason is that Congress came together, Republican and Democrat, and put together a 2-year macro funding agreement. And that agreement allows for significant increases for defense programs as well as domestic programs, and is a 13% overall increase above what was available in 2017. So that 13% increase allowed for making up for a lot of the proposed cuts and increases in the highest priority programs. With that overall funding, SCSEP was one of those programs restored. But we really had to, it was a shot across the bow in many ways. When the administration made their initial requests and when Congress had to look at where cuts could be made in the labor, HHS, and education department environment in which we are funded through the appropriations process, workforce programs were the first ones on the chopping block. And so that was a lesson learned. But thankfully, at the end of the day, we were made whole. So we were moved on to 2019, which just concluded this negotiations for funding this past month. And there was more good news. For the first time in 22 years, the Labor HHS Appropriations Bill was completed on time. And it was a remarkable effort. It was a bipartisan effort. And SCSEP lives for another year at $400 million. And why did this happen? It really speaks to the bipartisan nature of the Appropriations Committee and the overall process moving forward that allowed both parties to have a win and essentially support what the core priorities were and also reject major cuts proposed in the 2019 budget originally by the administration. So what happened in this last appropriations process that just completed? Well, the administration put forth an initial request for the budget that had very similar cuts to 2018. However, when that macro 2-year funding agreement was made in Congress with the 13% increase, they revised the request and they actually restored almost all of the cuts they had to workforce programs, except for SCSEP. The administration sought to continue their proposal to eliminate SCSEP. So we really understood where we were on the chopping block, front and center. The House was the first of the two chambers this past year to look at funding for labor, HHS, and education programs. And they actually didn't have any more funding overall available than they had in 2018. That 2018 13% increase was maintained in 2019, but not a dollar more. And as a result, Democrats said that's not enough for us for the core domestic programs we care about. And the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole, is one of the shrewdest and best liked members of Congress, said, wait a second here. I have a little less money in the House than there will be available in the Senate, and likely that when we get together in a House Senate conference, there'll be a little bit more available. He told us that in 2018, and in FY 2019 negotiations, he was right again. So thankfully, he was able to provide a roadmap for success moving forward. But in the House, they only moved this bill through committee, and it was purely on a party line basis because the Ds didn't think there was enough overall funding. Specifically to ETA, there was a cut, $216 million. We all was in good shape, as were apprenticeships, and SCSEP was level funded, which was great news because the prior year, the House initially had a reduction of $100 million for SCSEP in 2018 before it was fully restored in conference. So starting out level funded was great news. It speaks to the fact that there were members in Congress who really care about SCSEP. And we didn't start out starting out in a hole in 2019. The Senate has a new chairman of the committee, Richard Shelby, and as full committee chair, he said, "I'm going to work with my Democratic colleague Pat Leahy, and we're going to try to get as many of these appropriations bills done on time." And indeed, that's exactly what he did. He passed the labor HHS bill on the floor for the first time in over a decade in the Senate, which was remarkable enough, but then helped move it to completion for the first time in 2 decades. He did this by combining the labor HHS bill, which is the biggest domestic funding bill, with the defense appropriations bill, the most popular bill in Congress. Both parties support it. Republicans particularly concerned that they wanted to get this bill done before September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. They didn't want to have to extend the military, but they wanted to make sure that our defense understood what they would have moving forward before October 1 for the upcoming fiscal year. And so that train, the DoD train, really allowed the labor HHS bill to tag along for the ride, and it was a terrific strategy in order to get it done. The Senate bill itself, while it had $2 billion overall more than in the House labor HHS bill, actually level funded SCSEP and maintained overall funding for workforce programs, as you see a slight increase for apprenticeships. But the good news was we had the same number in the House and the Senate, which bode well for the third part of the negotiations process between the House and the Senate. We call that a conference negotiation later in the year. And in conference, there was more good news. The Department of Education did very well. They got a significant increase. NIH got a $2 billion increase. They were the big winners. And for the Department of Labor, thankfully, SCSEP, we were level funded once again, as was WIOA, and apprenticeships got a little bit of a boost. So it was a rare opportunity in late September to celebrate the fact that we were secure for our funding in 2019. The prior year, it wasn't done until March. So 6 months earlier, this bill was completed this year. However, there are significant concerns moving forward, and we'll talk about them in a moment. But that budget agreement was for only 2 years. And unless another agreement is made for overall spending, the levels of funding for domestic programs were reduced by 9% in 2020 and 7% in 2021. They're part of what was called the 2011 Budget Control Act, which has limits on overall spending. We call them caps for domestic as well as defense programs. So the Congress 2 years ago averted those caps by providing more funding, and we're hoping that will happen in the new Congress, but there'll be different dynamics. How will the two parties work together? If the Senate is led by Republicans and the House is led by Democrats, will it be more challenging to come to a macro funding agreement? Will people dig in their heels? We already know the administration is planning to put forth a budget proposal that's 5% below the Budget Control Act levels, a significant cut overall. Now, the good news is we've seen the last 2 years Congress has rejected the administration's request. We expect that will occur again in 2020 negotiations, but it could be a new negotiating environment. I think if the House stays in Republican control, we won't have these unanswered questions. We kind of understand how the process works, but if these capture one of the two chambers, it would be a different overall environment. Our goal, though, is to create an environment where there's sustainability, where folks in both parties, policymakers, understand the value and the return on investment that comes from CSEP and the services provided to older workers. The challenge we have is we've been in an environment for many years where cuts have been on the table. And we want to be able to protect those moving forward. That's our macro goal, and it'll be an ongoing effort. As far as what to expect with federal workforce policy in the future, we really have to understand, as supporters of older workers and the dual mission of CSEP, how broader workforce policy is being interpreted. We can't live in our silo. We have to understand what's happening and what are the trends moving forward. And specifically, there are 5 key themes that we've seen over the last 2 years when it comes to core education and workforce policy. And, the idea of education for education's sake is kind of out the window in an environment in higher education where there's over $1 trillion in student debt. There's a consensus among both conservatives and liberals that there needs to be work at the end, work opportunities at the end of an educational ladder. So with that degree or credential comes the opportunity to engage in the workplace and be able to pay down some of those extraordinary debts. And also the idea of being able to provide more skilled workers in an economy that's been booming and has more jobs than job seekers available at this moment in time. But work-based opportunities, as you see that with apprenticeships, have become something that both parties as well and the administration are very interested in. And finally, when we see mandatory programs, the discussion has been around should there be some sort of work-related activity in exchange for benefits. We've seen that right now in Medicaid programs, and also discussion in the SNAP employment and training world. The thing about these priorities is they touch upon CSEP, and many of them at some portion in what provision of services are offered to CSEP participants. But I don't think we've ever expressed them quite in that way. But these are the core thematic areas that we will see, that we're seeing now and we'll see in the next Congress, regardless of who controls it. As to the administration and where their priorities are, the president signed an executive order, the Pledge to the American Worker, and the president held a meeting today. I was witness that one where he brought in major employers again. They've talked about commitments. There you see 110 employers. Well, actually, they're at 120 major commitments, over 160 overall. And there are commitments to provide some level of training, apprenticeships, OJT, a host of different work-related improvements for our current workforce. It's now up to 6.3 million new opportunities that employers have committed to over the next 5 years. And Ivanka Trump's been to 14 states over the last few months looking at what works in workforce programs, kind of across the panoply from WIOA to the CET to looking at community colleges and to get a sense of what's happening related to best practices. And she's been the tip of the spear for the administration, has been dedicating a lot of her time and energy to this particular effort. And what they're saying is these are private sector investments to improve our overall workforce. And that's been their focus. The president himself said today that he believes that the industry can do a much better job of training than federal programming because they know the industry, the company that they're engaged in. So we're seeing a private sector push, both in apprenticeships and broadly through this American Worker Initiative. But that doesn't mean it's the only type of workforce-related issues that are being discussed in Washington. Part of the American Worker Initiative is the formation of a national council to think through on an interagency basis what workforce strategies work and the cabinet agencies put their heads around that. That's just beginning now in earnest. And there's also going to be a advisory board for the National Council that'll have 25 members from the private sector as well as state government and nonprofit leaders. Applications just were sent in over the last couple of weeks, and so the White House is sifting through them right now. the overall report on the American worker is due in January. It's a 6-month initiative, and Rosemary Lahansky, the Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Department of Labor, Reform, Employment, and Training, is the point person on this overall initiative, and she's working hard to help bring these disparate agencies together to form a coherent whole. It's a true challenge in a short time frame to put together that sort of a report. The other area that the administration is looking at broadly is the idea of work requirements and work in exchange for benefits. The Foundation for Government Accountability is a very influential organization that has done, with the administration, that's done significant polling on this issue. And overall, across the political spectrum, Americans feel like some sort of work-related activity is a good idea if someone's getting a federal benefit. And Democrats view it as punitive, but Republicans feel like this is a pretty good issue that they can score some political points. And philosophically, they believe that there should be something in exchange for getting this assistance from the government. So work requirements is going to be something that we're seeing. We're seeing it right now and will for the next at least 2 years. That's being led in the Medicaid environment, where 4 states and a 5th state, Wisconsin, just today, have been provided waivers to require able-bodied participants to engage in some form of work. Now, each of those 5 states have different ideas on who is able-bodied and what ages are able-bodied participants, but it is a trend to experiment with work requirements to see how Medicaid participation is changed and what sort of employment outcomes are derived from that. State workforce agencies in those 5 states, and as well as the others that are pending, the waivers where they're pending, have been engaged in a variety of ways to help try to smooth this work participation concept over. But it's certainly a trend that the president strongly supports. So those two are the major workforce things that we're seeing. But when we come to a combination of education and workforce, the Career and Technical Education Act was passed over the summer. And much like SCSEP, the CTE performance measures now are identical to WIOA. And there's the allowance, as there was earlier, but now a much more stronger encouragement to encompass in the WIOA state plan career and technical education, and really focus on work-based opportunities to help folks in high-demand occupations. You know, this is the trend of aligning with WIOA that we're seeing that is worth paying attention to. I know in the CTE world how challenging it is related to the performance requirements, but it's a trend not just in CTE, but also in a couple of issues Congress is talking about right now. The one area which has lots of bipartisan support is apprenticeships, but the challenge becomes what sort of apprenticeship. Democrats are very overall strongly supportive of registered apprenticeships, which is a state certification process, and the labor movement has been involved in lots of apprenticeship work over the last several decades, and they're all registered just about that come out of the labor movement. But it's a state certification process, and each state has its own process or works with the department's apprenticeship office to ensure that there is quality assurances. The administration came out with a different approach, IRAP, industry recognized apprenticeships, and put forth a report on that, and is also currently having a competition to fund business-led apprenticeships rather than having them government-led. I feel like that is probably a better approach to help our job seekers and apprentices move up the workforce ladder more quickly. The challenge is, regardless, there's not a lot of money out there for apprenticeships at this moment in time. $160 million in federal funds for registered apprenticeships in 2019, and the current competition out of DOL is $150 in other funding. So it's not a very big program at this moment in time, but there is a desire to, on a bipartisan basis, if possible, work on legislation in the new Congress related to kind of nailing down what is and what is not an apprenticeship. Another area where there's been a lot of discussion is TANF employment and training. And there were a lot of the macro point I was trying to make is in TANF, they're looking at work-related activities, not as a requirement, but an employment focus. And the SNAP program, they're thinking about work requirements and trying to figure that in Congress right now. And so we're seeing a push in a variety of pieces of legislation to focus on jobs, how to move people to employment. And the new purposes of CSEP overall line up quite well with that focus. And we have a reauthorization coming up in this upcoming year. And in chatting with folks on Capitol Hill, the committees of jurisdiction are just beginning to think about what changes should we be making to TANF. It was a bipartisan effort, as you know, in 2016, and I expect that we'll see the same thing again. The national grantees are working together to put forth a policy paper as well. So we're in our infancy in reauthorization of the Older Americans Act, and particularly Title V, but the dynamics related to macro workforce legislation seem to line up pretty well with the work that we've been doing. How would Congress change it if Democrats came into control? Well, on the campaign trail, they've been talking about three areas. Number one, being a check and balance on the president. And that seems to resonate with a fair amount of folks at this moment in time. Healthcare, which is ironically more popular in polling than the tax cut at this moment in time, has been a strength. Pre-existing conditions. Obviously, folks are worried about losing them. Both parties have been saying they preserve them, but Democrats seem to have a bit more energy behind their discussions related to preserving healthcare. And then talking about ending corruption and oversight of this particular administration. But the National Party has said, don't talk about the president, talk about the issues. Nancy Pelosi, who was likely to be the speaker if Democrats take over the House again, has talked about targeted oversight. Each committee has an oversight subcommittee. And they're talking about more concise and incisive oversight rather than just blanket requests. I've learned firsthand when working in the administration how devastating having oversight requests can be. It can take up to 80% of an agency's time responding to requests for Congress and information. And it really knocks the administration off their focus, their core foci when it comes to their policy priorities. So it's a very important tool for the opposition party in Congress. And they have subpoena power as the majority just to call anyone they would like to testify regarding specific issues. They don't have to ask the other party in Congress. The majority does it on their own. Now, these are a variety of areas where we could see oversight, just typical oversight about what's happened in a variety of things, as well as kind of good government and waste, fraud, and abuse. But we'll leave those to next year and when and if Democrats take over one chamber. When it comes to legislative items, they talk about three things. Number one, the Medicare for all idea and improving or refining Obamacare, not getting rid of it. Number two, a potential focus on infrastructure that would be bipartisan. And number three, ethics and lobbying reform. A bit of the president's called draining in the swamp, while the Democrats are really focused in on that and the minority at the moment. Specifically, when it comes to education and workforce priorities, the number two Democrat in the House, Steny Hoyer, has talked about apprenticeships and really expanding apprenticeships, which is something that Bobby Scott, the lead Democrat on education and workforce that oversees our programming, is also interested in expanding registered apprenticeships. Mr. Hoyer also talks about skills, and I think that really focuses in a variety of things on access, particular for education, higher education in particular, and training. And you see a few of the issues that he has brought up as priorities. But certainly, education and workforce will have a significant focus if Democrats take over control. We also see a shift from Mr. Cole to Rosa DeLauro on appropriations. Ms. DeLauro is one of the most liberal members of the House. She is a significant, strong supporter of CSEP and is in the best sense, an engaged and stirring presence on the Hill. She loves almost every program within labor HHS and is a passionate advocate. So I think we'd be in a little more stable shape there if Democrats took over control. And Bobby Scott from Virginia would be the chair. Virginia Fox would take over as the ranking member if there is a flip. As to the elections themselves, well, let's take a look at where we are right now. We know historically that the president's party loses seats almost every time in the House, as you can see, since the Civil War. And over the past 100 years, about 70% of the time, the Senate loses seats, governors nearly always lose seats, and state legislative seats. And that's really important in this Congress. This time, lose a lot of seats. And it's all about turnout, which is why you see the president going to areas where he can turn out his base in key Senate races, because at this moment in time, talking privately to Republicans, there is a pretty strong sense that they're going to lose that chamber, but the president's trying to save the Senate chamber over the course of the next 6 days. And the Democrats have a over 7% lead in the generic vote. There was an outlier poll today that said they had a 17% lead, saying, who would you like to be in control of Congress? Democrats, Republicans, 17 points leading to the Democrats. Overall, the average is 7 points. And all these stats are taken from Real Clear Politics, which combines the polls over a recent period and averages them. Real Clear Politics is an excellent resource to take a look at what's happening. And they point out that most folks feel like, despite the economy, we're on the wrong track here in America, and neither party is well liked. Both have a negative view. Both parties are viewed overwhelmingly negative by Americans, regardless of their political stripes. But in the last 8 midterms, this is really instructive that if the president's party's at if the president's approval ratings at 50% or higher, 56%, his own party does quite well in the midterm. But if the president's at 46% or less, it can mean catastrophe for his party in Congress, losing on average 7 seats in the Senate and 40 seats in the House. And right now, the president's at, actually, as of today, 44.2% overall approval rating. Very similar to what we saw in 2010 and 6. You see how President Obama lost 63 House seats and just a couple in the Senate, but George W. Bush lost 6 Senate seats. He was only at 39% at that moment in time. So Democrats are feeling pretty good because they only need 23 seats to recapture the majority, but it still could be, it's still a challenging number at this moment in time. And we have a strongly divided, the most divided politically society we've had, with 85% of Republicans saying they support the president, and you can see the nearly opposite numbers among independents and Democrats. But the enthusiasm gap has narrowed a bit as a result of the Kavanaugh confirmation vote. But what we're polling is beginning to show is Republicans' interest is not quite as strong as Democrats at this moment in time. And so whether or not the president can get party members to vote in this midterm, where 40% less folks turn out, is the open question, as Democrats are trying to create a blue wave to recapture the House. And I think it's an important measure to look at what Gallup survey says, that for those who disapprove of the president, there's a much stronger reaction than those who are approving of the president. 3-1 strongly disapprove when it comes to those who are disapproving of the president's performance. And that drives people to the polls, particularly since there are 6% more Democrats, registered Democrats, than Republicans overall. So if you have folks who are disapproving and you have more of them, it provides Democrats with that opportunity to recapture one of the congressional bodies. This is also a very interesting nugget here. Those who voted against or don't like anybody are moving towards the Democrats. Overwhelmingly, this portion of the electorate voted for President Trump and President Obama as well. And when you look at where they were in August and September, they were leaning slightly towards the Democrats. Well, the latest NBC Wall Street Journal has said these folks, which comprise up to 18% of overall voters, but not all of these folks are going to be voting nonetheless, are breaking extraordinarily strongly at the last moment for Democrats. And they've also indicated they're more willing to vote than the average voter. So that may be a harbinger of what to expect 6 days from now. Specifically in the House, if you want to throw a broad swath across what's happening, there are 95 competitive House districts. And only 14 for Republicans and only 14 for Democrats. That's 7-1 roughly. And if this middle column, I'm not sure if you can see it or not, all but 2 of the toss-ups right now are in districts controlled by Republicans. 29 Republican districts, only 2 Democrats. And there are 12 districts already leaning towards the Democrats. They're currently held by Republicans, and 4 goners, likely seats. So if Democrats capture those likely and leaning Democratic seats, that's 16 of the 23 they need. They only need a few more of those toss-ups to be able to capture that majority. So there, you can see why folks are nervous in the Republican Party about losing the House, because they're trying to defend so much terrain at once, particularly since 50 are already leaving, retiring, or running for other offices, and only 22 Democrats are. And what's important to know that most of these toss-up related seats are in affluent suburbs, and both parties are really chasing after college-educated women who are turning against the president. I think House members are hoping to make these races more local and more appealing as to their own candidacy rather than the president's. Democrats are feeling very good that their college-educated, particularly Republican college-educated women, are now moving in the Democrats' direction. Overall, there's a 33% lean towards the Democrat among college-educated women. And Democrats feel like that voter intensity, as well as how they've done in special elections today, as well, and the macro environment are in their favor. But Republicans are saying, incumbents generally do best, much better, 7% better than average. And the economy is in terrific shape. And they're talking about a Speaker Pelosi and using it and framing it in a way that no one wants to return back to the bad old days from their perspective, and helping get their voters out to the polls. The chair of the Republican National Congressional Campaign Committee is saying localize and motivate Trump voters. Get these folks out and compete in these suburban districts, particularly going after independent and women who are right now fluctuating as to which party they're going to support. That's the overall focus by localizing these races. That's the advice they're getting. The challenge, though, is Democrats have outraised Republicans. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to campaign cash in order to get your message out. And it's extraordinary that in the last 3 months before the election, 92 Republicans who were sitting members have been outraised by their opponent, some of which, the majority of which are 2-1 in that being outraised. Whereas very few incumbent Democrats are outraised by their own opponent. And, in the last 4 elections, 2/3 of incumbents who have less money on hand as of October lose their seats. So it's rather dire when it comes to overall funding for House members, House Republicans at this moment in time, and unprecedented fundraising by Democrats in comparison. So that's the environment in the House. and the Senate, quickly, look, we all know there are 26 seats that Democrats are defending, only 9 for Republicans, a historic margin. And it's very unlikely that Democrats are going to be able to capture the majority in this environment. 10 of the states were won by the president. The Democrats are defending 5 by 19 points or more, and only 3 Republican seats are in question at this moment in time. And when you look at where the majority in the Senate will be comprised, it's those 7 middle column toss-up seats: Nelson, Donnelly, McCaskill, and Tester on the Democrat side. Tester is actually his numbers have gone down because the president's particularly targeting him. He has a vendetta against Tester. Then 3 Republican seats, 2 retirements, and Dean Heller from Nevada are the only vulnerable ones. So, those 7 seats are going to determine the overall majority. And when you look and these numbers are as of this past Friday, late Friday, there really appear to be 3 potential pickups for the Republicans. Number one, North Dakota, that's down to 9 points. It was 14 points, where Heidi Heitkamp is in deep trouble, a Democrat. And in Missouri, Claire McCaskill is also in a dogfight to keep her seat. And Joe Donnelly in Indiana is in a toss-up seat at this moment in time. Those are the 3 potential best pickups. 3 more Democratic seats are in a little better shape, as you can see. But Montana, the president's going there, I believe, twice in the next 6 days, at least once. Tester's got a fight on his hands. But then those ones that we were talking about trending, or at least in question on the Republican side, Arizona seems to be the one that has the best pickup chance for the Democrats, followed by Nevada. But Tennessee and Ted Cruz in Texas look in good shape at this moment in time. So there's a very limited window for blue pickups, and there is a significant window of a couple of pickups by Republicans. And Democrats take some solace in that many more Republican seats are going to be up in 2020 and 22, but only 2 of those current seats in 2020 held by the Republicans are at all vulnerable at this moment in time. So what's our outlook? We expect razor-thin margins. It could be a handful of seats in the House. Either way, that would control the majority. And it looks like the Republicans will pick up 1, 2, or as many as 3 seats. And it's unlikely the Democrats can recapture the majority under those numbers. They'd have to hold all their seats and win 2 out of the 3 Republican toss-ups. That's going to be tough to do without a dramatic sea change at the last minute. So if we have a scenario we haven't seen in nearly 36 years. That is one chamber increasing seats for one party and the other chamber increasing seats for the other party. That really doesn't happen. Usually waves work in one direction. Very briefly, on the gubernatorial side, Republicans have done a fantastic job of consolidating gubernatorial seats and state legislatures. 36 states have elections, and nearly 2/3 are Republican seats, and Democrats only have 10 up. And the challenge for the Republicans is that half of these seats are open seats, meaning term-limited seats, whereas there are only 4 such seats for Democrats. So it makes for a competitive environment for Republicans. And in the state legislatures, almost all the seats are up in this cycle. And the Republicans hold the majority in 26 states in both chambers of the legislature. So it's been a tremendous effort over the last few years to consolidate power in the states for both Republicans. But the state legislators are really important because they're the ones who decide redistricting their congressional districts for the next 10 years. And that's why it's at the state level such an important election. There are 17 overall gubernatorial seats that could flip, and 12 of those 17 are held by Republicans. You can see a lot of red there among the toss-ups and leaning states at this moment in time. And when you look more closely in Florida, those numbers are gone down slightly, but the Democrat Andrew Gillum is slightly ahead of Rick Scott. In Georgia, Brian Kemp is the Republican. He's slightly ahead of Stacey Abrams. And you just go down the list. There's a number of seats, potentially as many as 7, that could turn over to the Democrats. And there could be a clean sweep in the Midwest, in Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, Ohio. These seats are leaning Democrat at this moment in time. So challenge is that it's almost flipping the map in the sense that Secretary Clinton won a good deal of the seats that Republicans are defending. And President Trump only won 1 of those states in which Democrats on the ballot. So I think if we used our crystal ball right now, it'd be a 7-seat difference moving towards the Democrats at the state level. And then, as I mentioned before, it's all about redistricting for the congressional districts in this midterm race at the state level. So lastly, we have to understand there's totally different dynamics which are driving these races. In the House, it's all about a fight in the suburbs, and moderate Republicans are particularly vulnerable. In the Senate, it's about playing on President Trump's battlefield from 2016, and Democrats are playing defense there. And for governors, they're trying to protect turf. Republicans are in states won by the secretary, which is why it's such a different and unique election this year. So with that, I'd be happy to stop and answer questions. I hope this has provided you with a macro overview of what we're dealing with when it comes to federal policy and Congress, as well as a sense of what direction we are moving forward in the midterms. We will know a lot more a week from today than we know at this moment in time. Thank you.
Thank you, John. So we have microphones in the back. Are there any questions for John? You know the protocol, John, how you kind of wait.
Yeah, that's always the first question. I don't blame them, but folks may want to enjoy Halloween as well. I know it's been a long day there today.
John, this is John Colbert. This is Gary, officer. Good afternoon to you.
Hi, Gary.
How are you?
Good.
Good. So my question is, as a network that is primarily focused around workforce development and specifically around SCSEP, as we embark onto the next budget fight, what suggestions would you offer us in terms of how we engage our congressional contacts to ensure that as the race for resources picks up, SCSEP doesn't fall behind? And I say this because in the last go-around when SCSEP was cut or was being eliminated, several programs that were on the chopping block actually saw their funding levels increased because they had built-in coalitions. So as we enter this journey and this pathway to this the next budget cycle, what must we start doing now that may inform our long-term chances of success?
Excellent question, Gary. And I know this has been a core focus for you in trying to and think collectively about how do we improve the overall outlook for SCSEP. I think that we start with the fact that there'll be about 100 or more new members of Congress coming to the House of Representatives, very few, if any, of whom has a significant background in SCSEP. And one thing we can do is educate members. It's not lobbying, but we can invite them to come on a site visit and understand how SCSEP works, how we're right at that crux between helping employers, providing assistance to CBOs and local governments, and with a strong return on investment. So bringing a new member of Congress in for a site visit, educating them about the program, meeting the participants, some of the employers, the host agencies, and giving them the tour is something that members appreciate because they're trying to learn about these programs in a very short amount of time. And also provides us with a chance to explain who we are and what we are, because we're a bit of an unknown. But as you saw in those top 5 overall consensus priorities in education and workforce programming, we had 4 out of those 5 nailed down by the daily work we're doing. So we have to be able to explain in simple terms to both experienced members and particularly new members about who we are and what we do. And there are very few programs that touch so many folks at the local level for a rather small investment. And so I think it's an opportunity for us since our funding has stabilized a bit, and I expect it to be stable moving forward because the administration's requests for cuts have been eliminated, to be able to tell our story in a very simple fashion over the course of this new Congress.
John, I have another question for you, and I apologize for manipulating the microphone, but tell me something. What you just said, I think, speaks more to the House than to the Senate. The Senate, as your report suggests, may remain in Republican hands with a greater majority. Does that now mean that we ought to focus some time in developing relationships with our friends in the U.S. Senate? Because as you know, the Senate numbers for SCSEP in the budget process for last go-around was below that of the House. What is the role of the Senate, and what must we do or could do to help inform how they engage and how they view SCSEP as an important program that merits their support?
Well, and another good question. I think all of us can get to know our congressional offices, invite the staff from those state offices, not the DC office necessarily, but invite the staff as a starting point from the local offices and inform them about SCSEP. Beyond the state level, what we want to create is a pipeline of information to DC. And by educating that local staffer, and then moving on to the DC folks as a second opportunity for a site visit during congressional recesses, and asking the local folks for help to bring forth the staff who will receive funding for labor HHS for a site visit. it's about development of relationships. It doesn't necessarily have to be at the member level because senators are extraordinarily busy. They are on 5 committees. They're representing a much larger constituency than House members. And it can be challenging to get them there. And so don't feel overwhelmed by what Gary is suggesting. It is just a chance to provide, to become a resource locally for your member of Congress, particularly those who sit on the Labor HHS Appropriations Committee. Those are the folks who are making the decisions. And the chair of that committee is Roy Blunt from Missouri. The ranking member is Patty Murray from Washington. They're the ones who are at the table developing framework for their bill. So if you're in those 2 states, your members are the ones who are making those ultimate decisions, and educating them about CSEP is time well spent. So I say start locally, move federally as their office becomes more sophisticated and as you feel more comfortable in telling the story of CSEP.
Great. I think we have another question.
Hey, John, I'm Paul Ross, and I'm the Executive Director of South Central Human Resource Agency in Southern Middle Tennessee. I think for the first time in history now, the government in 2018 will actually owe more debt than all American citizens combined. How will that affect appropriations going forward?
Well, the administration has said this is a high priority that they want to address in the next 2 years. The fact that national debt continues to climb. We have nearly $1 trillion in 2018, and nearly $1 trillion debt just this 1 year. I forget exactly what that number is, but it's well over $800 billion. And so, there is a great concern among both members of both parties about the fact that we're leaving a lifetime of debt for our kids and grandkids. As far as programs like CSEP, we're a relative drop in the bucket. And if you look at the kind of the return on investment that we provide to communities, we make a very good case that every dollar invested comes back several-fold as a result of CSEP. So I don't think that we are necessarily going to be front and center as a target or reducing the debt by cutting funding for CSEP, but we're going to be caught in a much more macro debate about overall domestic spending, overall defense spending, what is an acceptable level for both parties, and is this something the president will sign off on moving forward with a much more structured focus on the debt? Democrats say, well, you created a couple $1 trillion in tax cuts. This is not the right time for you to look at cutting our appropriations funding or entitlements, and Republicans will have a very different view of that. The tax cuts are for growth, and if we have a large debt, well, we need to be able to address it more directly. So I've gone along a kind of a whirlwind or a circular way of saying that we're part of a much bigger discussion. But on the ground, I think we can do our legwork through educating members about preserving the CSEP program for the longer term in order to help provide opportunities, whether through community service or private sector employment, in a way that makes sense fiscally.
Another question.
Hi, John. This is Mitch Wu from Chinese American Planning Council in New York City. My question is, how much influence would state governors have on the federal CSEP program?
Well, what happens each in January, February, and March, members of Congress ask their constituents and ask their mayors as well as governors for help in what their priorities should be for funding for the upcoming year. And having an engaged governor in that effort, it would be extraordinarily helpful. The NGA, for example, has a education and training subcommittee that this past year said workforce was a high priority for the NGA. And that was effective with appropriators. But individual governors weighing in with their delegations it's a very, very helpful tool when it comes to federal appropriations, because federal elected officials want to ensure their goals, their priorities reflect the needs at home. And nobody knows statewide goals like a governor, just like a mayor does locally. So an engaged governor is a very helpful advocate in this overall funding discussion.
We have another question. That would be you, Bob.
Hi, John. Bob Herudian.
Hey, Bob.
I saw a column written by, I believe it was a cousin of President Trump, and she runs the foundation. But the whole article was about President Trump's high commitment to workforce development. And, of course, nothing in that column mentioned older workers or certainly the CSEP program. If they're putting forward, or in this column, she's putting forward this premise about his solid commitment to workforce development, how can they then justify 2 successive years of proposed zero funding for the program?
Well, Bob, that's an interesting question. I think when they're talking about the president's support for workforce programming, we've seen a really strong focus on apprenticeships. And we've also seen through his American Worker Initiative, getting the private sector engaged to help train and more workers. So those are kind of his areas of focus related to federal workforce programming. CSEP falls below the radar, unfortunately, in both parties, or at least has historically. And we've had real trouble with the Office of Management and Budget, which still relies on the part analysis of 2004 that deems CSEP not to be an effective program. So until we have a gold star evaluation that can push back on that, we're going to have trouble with those career staff at OMB, regardless of which administration it is, to say we should be supporting funding for CSEP. I just don't think that this current administration has really dived deep into the specific programs outside of apprenticeship that are run at the federal level. But there is a great deal of enthusiasm that has captured the president's focus related to apprenticeships, not because of his TV show, just because he knows that from his building background and views it as a public-private partnership that has the chance for replication. Secretary Acosta is very strong on apprenticeships as well, as are the senior staff of the department. So I wouldn't necessarily take it as a personal affront about the president and CSEP. I don't think he or his senior leadership are really very much aware of this program. I do think our fight is with OMB more than it is with a particular administration when it comes to presidential budget proposals.
Any more questions? John, you have been thorough, as always, with your incredible information. You're taller than I remember. But we really appreciate you being with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you allowing me to join you in remotely. I really wanted to be there, and greatly appreciate the work of the Senior Service America team to ensure I could participate. It's been a pleasure, and enjoy your Halloween Eve.
Great. Listen for your applause.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.